Hi there, Malcolm here with my 113th Booktube video, and today, as it's Halloween, I'll be doing something slightly different. I'll be reading a scary story of my own devising from my book, Flavours, a short story compilation, and it is titled Oak. So let's get cracking. Arthur D. Bellamy watched the swallows ride the gentle summer breeze before alighting upon the solitary oak that overlooked the rising path he was currently journeying. The oak was countless years old, and a significant waypoint upon Arthur's daily country walk. It sat just shy of the top of the low hill from which miles of cultivated fields and woodland could be seen, the oak being the only single feature dominating the scene with its presence. Each day, come rain or shine, Arthur would pause under the oak's outreaching branches and gauge the day by how far he could see. On a good day, the town of Berkhamsted could be seen as a vague grey smudge on the horizon. Today, the haziness brought the limit a lot closer than Arthur had originally thought, and visibly started when he saw that he could barely see beyond the copse of trees bordering the fallow field he was in. It is a few beats later that he realised that he could no longer hear the call of the swallows from the boughs overhead. Scanning the pale blue sky, he saw no sign of the birds. Neither did he spy anything else. Being this close to London, there was the permanent presence of exhaust trails across the sky by day and blinking lights at night. From his current vantage point, Arthur should be able to spot signs of at least 3 aeroplanes. The uniform azure sky was devoid of any blemish. Somewhat unsettled, Arthur resumed his way. A gentle downhill slope led to a stile leading into an adjoining field. The path leading along the edge of the field sported a steeper downward slant to the stile at the bottom. His left elbow brushed the branches hanging over the barbed wire fence. Unexpectedly, Susie ran past him, trailing her lead, and scampered down the hill under the stile at the bottom and off to the left, behind the copse. Arthur looked round for Stan, the white poodle's owner. Of Stan there was no sign. Arthur made a half-hearted attempt to go after the runaway dog, a rescued animal whose sole agenda seemed to be escape, but instantly realised the futility of the effort. More importantly was the well-being of Stan, a gentleman in his late 60s with whom Arthur had exchanged pleasantries every day for the past 27 years, and 5 dogs. Huffing with the exertion of retracing his steps up an incline he ordinarily would scale at a much gentler pace, Arthur called out Stan's name. At the stile there had still been no sign. Usually Arthur would pass Stan at the bottom of the hill he'd just climbed, having walked his jaunt in the lower woods before doubling back on himself. Despite the countless times they passed, he'd never actually considered where Stan would be at certain stages of his own walk. He supposed that usually Stan would have just left the road to cross the stile leading to the path, bisecting the fallow field around the time he reached the bottom of the second field. Of course, each day was slightly different, where other obligations brought forward or put back the time of leaving the house. But on the whole, both Arthur and Stan were pretty regular. As he climbed the much gentler rise, the oak tree rose into view, but still no sign of Stan. He shivered as the next gust caught him. A chill went through him that was at odds with a cloudless summer day. A whining followed the next breeze, and Arthur picked up the pace and reached the summit. The oak tree sat in all its gnarled glory before him, but of Stan he could see nothing. He stopped for a few moments to get his breath back and scanned the wild landscape for any sign of Susie's owner. His breath caught when he realised that the haze now obscured the copse. The whine caught his attention again, and he spun round to the oak tree from whence it came. No, it came from the other side. Curiously, but tentatively, Arthur moved around and came to a standstill when he spotted the source. Standing there with her tail between her legs shivered Susie, her red lead caught somehow on the rough bark of the oak. Automatically, Arthur snapped his head round toward where he last saw her, darting past him like a dervish, but he couldn't fathom how she could have gotten here before him. He stepped forward to loosen the lead from the gnarled, stubby protuberance, and initially recoiled when the resemblance to human fingers became apparent to him. His double take turned into full horror when he realised that they did not merely resemble fingers. A cacophony of calls from as yet unseen crows from the boughs overhead filled in for Arthur's silent scream. The impact of his backside on the thistle-strewn ground snapped him out of his shock, and he quickly scrabbled back to his feet, tearing his shirt at the right elbow in a vicious patch of thistles. The boughs exploded in a feathery eruption of crows that came out in droves and scattered off in all directions. In an act of postponing looking again at the disturbing image sticking out of the bark of the looming oak, Arthur stared, dumbfounded. The birds quickly disappeared into the haze that had crept down into the field. Tall, scraggy thistles covered the much reduced visible expanse. Dragging his eyes back to the grotesque image, it took Arthur a few moments to notice that Susie had somehow disentangled herself from the clawed fingers and had disappeared from view. He looked round again to see if she was still nearby, but she was gone. He took a step toward the unpleasantness before looking again and let out a startled scream when a still tethered Susie nipped at his heels. Unlike his previous outburst, this irritation was short and sharp and had a slight ring to it, as if he were in a large but enclosed room. As if ashamed by her actions, Susie lay down and buried her muzzle in her paws. Another step and he was now close enough to the fingers to touch them. Arthur stopped and asked himself why he would want to touch the fingers. Susie's whimper reminded him he was to set her free from its rigid grip. Sending a tentative, shaky hand, Arthur reached out to the little finger, around which the lead was snagged. At a mere few inches away, the finger suddenly withdrew into the trunk of the tree with an exaggerated, organic squelching sound. The end of the lead went in with them, and the bark had somehow closed over where the digits had been. Arthur stared at the point where the blood-red lead stuck straight out of the tree like a single instance of a severed artery mid-spurt. Only when he reached out to touch the lead did he realise that his hand was cut by the other against his shoulder in full recoil. A whimpering made him look round, but all he could see was the haze which reached just beyond the outermost tips of the oak. He knew he would like to think that it was just the wind rustling the alien silhouettes of the man-sized thistles. He also knew a whimper when he heard one. Having already gone through the harrowing and mind-wrenching experiences, the sudden stench of mouldy earth accompanying the whimpers was almost bearable, but not nearly enough. With his hand on his lead, he looked down and saw the rotting, maggot-infested carcass that was once Susie. The dirty, white, wriggling grains of rice in her empty eye socket made him retch and turn away. The buzzing of flies became a feeble whimpering as he looked back to see her whole and healthy and miserable. Enough was enough. Arthur was fed up of these mind games, or haunting, or whatever this was. He moved to leave and brave the whispering haze, but found he couldn't let go of the lead. His hand was holding on as if his life depended on it, and would not open up. The knuckles were white from either the tight grip or the terror. Nothing for it, he thought, but to somehow wrench it out of the oak tree. His first pull yielded no results, but his second rewarded him with a few more inches of exposed lead. Each pull became easier, and each pull produced more and more lead. It spooled around his feet like spaghetti. It was only after a few dozen metres were extruded from the trunk did Arthur stem the mindless panic he found himself in. Arthur tried a new strategy and pulled his penknife from his pocket. It didn't hugely surprise him that the blade was totally ineffective on the lead. A discomfort had been slowly growing about his ankle and had now become painful. He looked down and saw that the excess had wrapped itself around his leg and grown taut. The lead led out and disappeared into the haze. He couldn't make out Susie in the swirling grey tendrils. At first he feared that the lead would be inseparable from his ankle as it was from his hand, but he was able to produce enough slack to pull his foot out. Turning his attention back to his hand, he noticed that there was less of the impossible lead between the tree and the hand. Indeed, as he looked, the lead slowly, almost imperceptibly, retracted into the coarse bark. He tried pulling again, and it spooled out as before. At that instant, something snapped. He couldn't bear it any longer. He ran. He didn't pick any direction beyond away from the tree. In moments he was in the whispering swirls and prickly thistles. Each prickled knee and every murmur in the air spurred his flight on and on through the endless vasts of miasma. No sooner did the haze clear a little than Arthur tripped and sprawled painfully on a comparatively thistle-free patch of earth. Dazedly he sat up and sought out the cause of his fall. Still twanging in the air stretched the arterial red of the lead. To the left it vanished into the haze. To the right it vanished into the oak tree, looming in its whispering vortex. Screaming in a way he'd never screamed before, he dashed back into the haze. He had to get away from that cursed tree. The whispering had become louder. He could almost make out the words, but he refused to listen. He could hear Susie barking as well, but he ignored that too. He saw a flash of red and jumped in time to vault the lead, going from nowhere and heading nowhere. A few steps and he had to jump again. And again. The leads came thick and fast, and he quickly ran out of breath. He stumbled over the next lead and fell into the next one. It caught him round the throat and quickly cut off his air supply. His hands flew up to the garrote as he pulled with all his might. His vision darkened round the peripheral, but before it went completely he managed to free his airway. Taking a deep, earthy breath, Arthur found himself in a new conundrum. Both hands were firmly grasping the lead that he just freed himself from. His right hand was also grasping the lead sticking out of the tree. It was beyond him to comprehend that it was another portion of the same impossible lead. The lead formed a T-shape as it vanished to his left, his right, and behind him. Like a slave pushing a giant wheel, Arthur bent his back and pushed forward against the substantial resistance of what he saw as 3 leads. At the slower pace, the regular red tripwires were more of a nuisance than any real hindrance. As he disentangled his foot from a cluster of leads, he became aware that something was missing. The swirling, trotting soup around him was full of strips of red, but totally devoid of thistles. He thought for a moment he'd left the field and found the road, but remembered that the stile separated the two. That hard grey ground was desolate, but not asphalt, and possibly accounted for the odd zipping sound of the wind. He turned around and pulled his way for a few more feet until his back thumped up against something. He instinctively knew what it was, and he felt his skin crawl under his shirt as he leapt from the oak tree. He saw movement on the bark where it had touched it, and with the same organic sound as before, the fingers grew out of it, clasped at the air he'd just vacated, clasped into a fist as if in frustration, and withdrew back into the tree. Despite having seen the fingers before, Arthur was no less horrified at their presence, particularly as they seemed to be groping about for him. He became aware that the ongoing peculiar zipping noise was not, as he had initially dismissed, the wind, but was in fact something much more recognisable. The instant he remembered where he had heard the sound before, he snapped round to the part of the tree from where the lead emanated. Sure enough, the sound of the lead withdrawing at high speed back into the bark was exactly the same as that of one of those extendable and retractable leads. How long had this been going on, Arthur had no idea, nor did he know how much slack he had left. In terror he looked at his unresponsive hands. They were still locked tight on the two parts of the accursed lead. At some random moment the slack would have been taken up. He didn't dare consider the implications of that moment. In a flash of inspiration, Arthur quickly dragged his portion of the lead around the tree in a bid to tie it off, and subvert the colossal shock when the slack ran out. He made a few passes when he had to stop for a breather. He was confident that he had done enough to save himself. His breath caught when the bark began to shift like molten lava and the tree rotated. The boughs swung overhead like some grotesque propeller. The lead didn't unravel, but simply impossibly passed through the very trunk itself before being deposited on the ground in front of him, like spilled intestines. The boughs ceased their movement, and the only sound was the zipping, which drowned out even the chattering haze. All at once the pile began to unspool as the slack had been taken up and was whisked off into the haze. He closed his eyes at the last moment, his whole body tense for the awful moment. The signs were so shocking Arthur fell to his knees, but even then refused to open his tightly closed eyes. The lack of pain, the lack of bone-wrenching, finger-severing yanking, finally built his curiosity to the point where he had to look at the remains of his hands. Tentatively, his eyelids lifted, and two slightly grazed and grubby but otherwise intact hands sat on his wrists where they were supposed to be. His fingers wriggled dutifully. A red line then sprouted across both hands, and the top half of his hands plopped onto the ground like two discarded rubber gloves. Two thumbs accompanying blooded stumps were all that remained. Arthur roared in pain and horror. His tears clouded his vision as he tried reaching down to retrieve his lost fingers. Opposing thumbs, however, are only of any use if they have something opposite them. Fury at his loss overcame him, and he turned to the object of his torment and ran at the oak. The chattering around him was open laughter now, numerous voices differing in pitch and timbre. Low guffaws to high giggles and raucous cackles egged Arthur on as he performed his first and only roundhouse kick and planted it solidly into the waiting fingers, a cruel parody of the cooling deposits behind him. Instantly, like a Venus flytrap, the fingers closed over Arthur's boot and began to withdraw into the tree once more. Unbalanced, Arthur fell forward and did his best to dislodge himself from the vice-like grip. The rough ground quickly opened his wrists up, putting a halt to his only remaining means of leverage. Unexpectedly, the angle at which his foot was being dragged into the tree released it from its boot, and Arthur found himself free once more. He laid there, his agony threatening to render him unconscious, something the blood loss was already working towards. Arthur rolled over and looked down his body to the tree as it loomed menacingly over him. The haze had stilled, and not a sound could be heard from it. Slowly he pushed himself up onto his elbows and was contemplating the next step, when the trunk of the tree yawned open wide, revealing a cavernous void riddled with a worm-like root system that would ordinarily be found underground. Horribly, held up in the centre of the void by the roots, was a grotesque amalgam of Stan and Susie. This mind-shattering entity lunged forward, grabbed Arthur round the shoulders, and pulled his shrieking form deep into the void. The bark closed up over him, and the field became silent once more. Audrey controlled her breathing as she jogged up the steep gradient of the path. She could feel the sweat pooling between her shoulder blades and soaking her new black and neon pink jogging suit. The endless blue sky was beautiful, but the harsh payment of the beating sun was taking its toll. At the stile she stopped for a moment and hydrated from a water bottle. A quick hop over the stile, and it was now the home straight past the oak tree. The much gentler slope gave her a burst of strength, and she quickened the pace, already anticipating the downhill slope to the final stile. She recognised the figure of Arthur heading the same way. "Glorious day, isn't it?" she declared in passing, wrinkling her nose at an odd but unpleasant earthy odour. She was already several paces in front of him when she heard his reply, as clearly as if he were right next to her. "This one is mine." I hope you enjoyed that. That was one of the 9 stories from my short story collection. They're not all horror, there's all sorts of genres in there. So if you enjoyed that and you want to see more, then if you follow the link in the description box below, it'll take you to the Amazon page where you can buy or rent this book, either as an ebook or as a physical copy. And if you'd like me to read any of my other stories, then please let me know which ones. Or alternatively, if you've got a short story of your own you'd like me to read, then please leave a link in the comment section down below. But as usual, if you've nothing nice to say, then please keep it to yourself. Thank you, and until next time, see you later.